Well, hello again. My name is Sławomir. I'm honored to chair the first plenary session of Polish-British 16th edition of the Belvedere Forum, and we decided, and I think it doesn't sound too controversial, that we will start our conversation on this forum from a subject which brought three countries, three nations, three societies on the same page. That is Ukraine. On 24th of February, 6 in the morning, I tweeted the following words. Putin waged a war against Ukraine, a peaceful country that is to be punished and turned into ruins for aspiring for freedom and independence of Russia. Ukraine's defending itself has to be assisted. Putin's Russia has to be sanctioned strong and kick out of all words silence. Now we are, after Ukraine is in the sixth month of war, United Kingdom show spectacular leadership of the free world, providing weapons, financial assistance, political support, and showing Europe how it should shape its policy towards Russia, an aggressor state, and Ukraine, fighting against Russian aggression. To this discussion, we have invited an excellent speakers. I hope that Angus Lapsley is with us. Angus is one of the best experienced civil servants in this country, working for years on security, defense, and policies. Angus was involved also in integrated review, which after Brexit was very important policy guideline for all corners of the government and also institutions. And so Angus would probably help us to understand the reasoning behind British policy towards Ukraine and how this policy may be conducted in the future. Then we have Professor Żurawski, Grajewski, a professor of Łódź University, very renowned expert on foreign and defense policies in Poland, advisor to the president, advisor to the Polish foreign minister, a kind of leading, one of the leading figures in our domestic debate about foreign policy. So, Professor, thank you very much for being with us. And last but not least, there is in very traditional way, very important for Polish political tradition, nothing about us without us, free the free, equal with the equal. We decided to invite Mykola Bielieskov from Ukraine because we want to talk about our policies, British, Polish, European, transatlantic towards Ukraine and Russia. But we want to have a Ukrainian voice into this conversation. We want to hear from Mykola what Ukrainians' expectations towards our respective policies are, and what we should do to assist Ukraine and Ukrainians even more effectively than we used to, than we have been doing so far. So I will start with Angus, maybe a bit in provoking way. United Kingdom likes wars, don't you? Because it's this country I think won more wars than lose one. So you are on the winning side very often, and it helped to create this your wins helped to create this country. And culture and political tradition, also strategic tradition. So United Kingdom also sees wars as opportunity, political opportunity to shape the world and make the world better. So Angus, can you enlighten us what criteria of effective engagement on the side of Ukraine has been adopted by United Kingdom? How we should assess that? What was a driver behind your leadership, and why you decided to be at the front of the helping Ukraine? Angus, the floor is yours, and I have to explain that only due to the COVID is still around us, and so that's the reason why Angus is isolated from other speakers, and so thank you very much that despite of that you find time to be with us. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Sławomir, and thank you to you and to Chatham House and the Belvedere Forum for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure to be on this very distinguished panel. So, look, I don't know whether the United Kingdom likes wars or not, but as you say, we've certainly been involved in a few over the years. And I think we certainly have retained a strategic culture, by which I mean a culture of believing that our security and the security of our allies cannot be taken for granted. And it's something that you have to work actively for, and you have to go out and create. You can't just assume it will happen. And that's why we have for many years maintained a reasonably high defense budget, meeting the NATO target of 2%. And it's why every couple of years we undertake a major exercise of reviewing our strategic commitments, as we did in 2020 and 2021. And if you look back at the conclusions of that integrated review in 2021, we were very clear that European security remained the United Kingdom's most important security concern. We believe very strongly that we also need to think globally, but European security is the foundation of that global role. And we also concluded that Russia was the most acute and the most immediate and the most serious threat to our security and to the security of Europe as a whole. And that led us to the conclusion that we should base our future security on a commitment to NATO and to wider European security. That said, in other words, we thought about this. And to some extent, we were predicting what was coming. That said, I think we have all, including the United Kingdom, been shocked by just how far Russia has been prepared to go. The cynical, callous actions that it took in invading Ukraine without any provocation. And I think what's happened in Ukraine has been a major wake-up call for the United Kingdom, as it has for other European countries. And you could maybe argue there was a spectrum of opinion in Europe between those countries like Poland and Lithuania, who were saying for many, many years, that something bad is coming from Russia, and those who tended to downplay the risks from Russia. And we were perhaps closer to the Polish and Lithuanian end of the spectrum than many in Europe were. But even we were taken by surprise, I think, strategically about how far Russia was prepared to go. And I think quite a lot has changed. 2 years ago, I think we saw our relationship with Poland as an important relationship that was growing. But in some ways, we had slightly different priorities. And I think we saw ourselves as having an enduring commitment to Ukraine through the training that we were running for Operation Orbital, but it was competing alongside many other priorities for our time. I think if you wind on 2 years, you now see a Britain which believes, I think very, very strongly, that what has happened to Ukraine, this callous invasion by Russia, is by a long, long way the most important security challenge that we face as Europeans and as members of the transatlantic alliance. And I think we feel very passionately now that Ukraine's security is our security and it's NATO's security. And that's why I think there is a very strong, analytical and political conviction in Britain, which I think is shared certainly by all of the current government, but I think it's also shared across the political spectrum in Britain. You see the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, the Scottish Nationalists, they all feel the same way about this. That actually it is in Britain's interests and it's Britain's sort of duty and our moral obligation to do absolutely what we can to help Ukraine. We believe that to do that, we have to do what we can now to get as much heavy weaponry, ammunition and equipment into Ukraine as we possibly can. We think that Ukraine has to win this war and Vladimir Putin and Russia have to lose this war. And yeah, there may be a place for negotiations at the end of this conflict at some point, and it will be for Ukraine to judge as and when we get to that point. But right here, right now, what we have to do is to help Ukraine win. Economic support, political support, and military support. I mean, I would say that two things just to sort of wrap up before we move on. I mean, I think we think this is going to take time. We don't believe that we can assume that this conflict will end quickly. And we think we need to be planning on the basis that we in the West will have to be supporting Ukraine through thick and thin in the months and possibly years to come. So I think we are preparing ourselves politically, financially, militarily for a long, drawn-out period of assistance to Ukraine. I think secondly, and I think this is important for the Belvedere Forum, this has brought us together with Poland in really important ways, I think. I think that we see things through Polish eyes, I think, rather more than we did even 6 months ago. And many of you who know me know that I live down here in Canterbury, in Kent. And not long after the invasion of Ukraine, I was out for a run. And I came across, in one of the graveyards here, I came across the grave of Joseph Conrad, who, of course, was a Pole born in what is now Ukraine, who came to make his life in Britain. And it got me, I thought I should go back and read some Conrad again. And I read his great novel, Under Western Eyes. And the great thing about that novel is it's about Russia. It's about the malign, toxic politics of Russia. But it takes a Pole to explain to the English characters in that book what is happening and how to understand what is happening in Russia. And I think that sort of process of seeing security in Eastern European security through Polish eyes is kind of what has happened to Britain over the last 6 months. And I think that will be sustained. And I can see a lasting partnership starting to emerge where Britain and Poland are, perhaps of all European, certainly the larger European countries, the most committed to supporting Ukraine over the long term, and also to building security generally in Eastern Europe, whether it's in the Baltic, whether it's in the Slovakia Gap, and Poland's own strategic challenges. And that explains why we have those extra troops in Poland. It explains why we reinforced our presence in the Baltic, why we're increasing defense spending, and why I think we will make a sustained commitment to Ukraine. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Angus, for outlining, I think very well, the reasoning behind British policy towards Russian aggression on Ukraine and Ukraine's war, Ukraine's defending themselves. I would say I would have an additional question to you, but I would ask you to respond it later on. How you would define Ukraine's winning? Because that's, Minister Przydacz in his introductory remarks said that Poland stands on the position that Ukraine must win. You said that Ukraine has to win. So the problem would be with the definition of winning. So how it will be on from the British point of view. Now I would like to turn microphone to Professor Żurawski Grajewski and ask him very similar question, the same question, also trying to provoke him a little bit in the beginning. So I would ask the following question. Well, we Poles sitting between Germany and Russia, we can't like wars. And I think we lost more wars than won. So actually, please explain to us, to Professor, to our public, to audience, why we are so determined in helping Ukraine and Ukrainians. We could be scared of the situation. We could sit on our hands and waiting for further developments. Why we jump into this so much? We send 2 tank brigades just like that to Ukrainians, as if we are not afraid of Russian invasion on us. So we disarmed ourselves to help Ukraine in the way. Why we did so?
Thank you very much for that excellent question. Being a historian, I can't help to make that historical introduction. So first, yes, we used to be, there is a debate in Poland whether the Republican monarchy or the monarchical republic since 1505, and republics generally don't like wars. So in the old Polish language, we have a special word for a campaign. That word is potrzeba, which means necessity. Necessity. Why we do all of that? Because it's necessary. It's indispensable to save our country. We have fought 18 wars against Russia. The first one started in 1492. So we are very experienced with that particular enemy. And we cannot afford nourishing any illusions. As far as Ukraine is concerned, we remember that when Russians took Kiev for the first time in 1654, next year they took Vilnius, that was burning for 2 weeks, and 20,000 of people were slaughtered. The university was destroyed, and the professors, those who survived, fled to Königsberg, thus helping to create the famous alma mater of Kant. Next year, foreign troops took Warsaw, and since that time, till 1993, each Polish generation saw foreign troops on our soil. This is why Ukraine is that important. You asked me about military equipment that was given to Ukraine, thus reducing Polish potential. It's another important historical experience. We know that nothing can compensate the loss of the entire army of the country that is at war on the same side. I think I can afford saying that nothing compensated, no British or French armaments compensating the loss of Polish army between September 1939 and May 1940. So whether we have those 2 brigades of tanks or not is less important than the existence of Ukraine with its army. And this is simply a very sober calculation, what is more and what is less important. And as far as the war goals are concerned, that question about how we could define the Ukrainian victory, I'm afraid I will be accused of presenting wishful thinking, but to protect myself against that accusation, I would say that the opposite scenario is wishful thinking too. I mean, the only possible scenario of decisive victory is the situation in which Russia is defeated on the battlefield, according to the old principle of Polish diplomacy that was presented to our European partners as early as in 1831, during Polish uprising against Russia in 19th century. Our diplomacy tried to convince our partners that Russian expansionism knows only those limits that are created by the military forces of the peoples threatened by it. We cannot create any legal treaty-based guarantees of peace because Russia will violate all the obligations, as it always does. And I would say I would be reluctant to describe the Russian way of war if I had been asked in January in a realistic way, because I would be forced to be so stereotypical. I mean, all Polish stereotypes I should present it, and this would create the impression that we are under the influence of our history. But the way in which Russia is fighting that war acknowledge all the stereotypes that exist in Poland. It's cruel, it's genocidal, it's aiming at the extermination of the elites. We even know a special Russian word for that, it's obezhołowlenie, which means decapitization. This is the looting of the country, observing no rules of civilized peoples. So, what is the definition of the victory? Russia must be defeated on the battlefield in a decisive and obvious way in order to be convinced as a society, not only as the elites, that the war was lost. Unlikely the Cold War, which Russia lost in a way similar to the one that was experienced by Germany in 1918. I mean, the Germans lost the First World War in a way in which an average German was not convinced the war was really lost. This is why revenge was a new program. Russia lost the Cold War in such an unconvincing way, and this is why the majority of Russian thinks that successful revenge is possible. And unless we convince them that it's not true, we can only achieve some armistice, fragile suspensions of hostilities, but never a real, sustainable, long-lasting peace. So either Russia is defeated, either it will be only a break between the wars, like between the First and the Chechen War, but we cannot create new, stable international order.
Thank you very much, Przemek. I will reshape my question, my second short question to you, in a way that I'm not going to ask you how we should define winning of Ukraine, because you already gave some hints on that. But I would ask you to define the term defeat Russia, because that's also politically important thing. And it could also mean something different than, to help Ukraine win this war. So I will give you a few minutes to think about it. Now, I would like to pass the floor to Mykola. Thank you very much, Mykola, that you accept our invitation. I would like to thank Bartosz Cichocki, Polish ambassador to Kyiv, who has never left the post during this war, who provided, he personally helped us to bring you here. So, Bartosz, thank you for your help. Mykola, the question to you is following. You see British government, Polish government providing enormous assistance to Ukraine. President Duda spoke on the Verkhovna Rada, and that was his historical speech. Boris Johnson traveled to Kyiv very bravely, and also is recognized by Ukrainian society as one of the world leaders and the heroes of Ukraine. So what more both countries can do for Ukraine to provide this effective assistance, to provide tangible, concrete help for the country? What we can do more to help you defeat Russia? And how you, in the end, would define winning of Ukraine and defeating Russia? Mykola, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and it's a great pleasure to be here to listen to these words said by representatives by UK, by Poland, because again, it's a very favorable environment to sit here, and countless times words like-minded on the same page were used. And I would say, first of all, I briefly want to assess what we saw, and I would start from the very conclusion that both UK and Poland, they set the example how the Russian-Ukraine all-out war should be addressed by the international community. And by this, both governments lived up to the special Ukraine-NATO Charter that is 25 years old, almost 25 years old, that stated that free and independent Ukraine is fundamental seen for Europe to be whole, free, and peace. And it was rightly said, otherwise Ukraine would be a launching pad and also be used as a human material for Russian imperialism and for Russia to project power in Europe. So two countries, they set examples. In what kind of things? First of all, both governments decided to preemptively strengthen Ukraine. So steps were taken before 24th of February 2022 to provide Ukraine with armaments. So no one was waiting for Russia to broaden its aggression. I want to emphasize broaden aggression, because aggression started in 2014. It was a kind of limited aggression. It's a very important thing. So it was preemptive strengthening of Ukraine. Then both governments decided to up the ante and move to the next level. So it was not only a light system like anti-tank guided missiles like Manpads. Both governments decided to provide us with heavy weaponry. And also it was a kind of example. Another very important thing is making case for Ukraine, because of course, Ukrainian voice is strong. Our president is on its own making a good case for Ukraine, but we are glad that we are not alone, and our voice and our ideas are multiplied. So it's again a great pleasure to hear both from my co-panelists that there is no other way than Ukraine should win and Russia should lose. Russia should be decisively defeated. Because alas, here, of course, we are on the same page, but there are different opinions. There is active discussion about the end game and so on. But and that's why it's very valuable to have both Poland and the UK to make such a strong and equivocal case for Ukraine. So I would say that it's a kind of brilliant example demonstrated by both countries. You lived to the commitments made 25 years ago. You set the example, and you continue to do so, both as a case was made by Boris Johnson in the Times newspaper and made by President of Poland Andrzej Duda in Verkhovna Rada address physically. As to what Ukraine wants to see, well, given the fact that it's a war of attrition in military terms and war of exhaustion more broadly strategically, well, in this kind of war, everything would be decided by constant supply of resources, different kind of resources. So that's why Ukrainian government, Ukrainian experts, we are constantly making the case that we need more of heavy weaponry, and we need, first of all, long-range fires, because it's no more the battle and the war of close contact, when this NLAW, Javelin, and others were useful one, important one. Now it's non-contact warfare, first of all, through artillery. It's basically artillery versus artillery fight. So that's why we are constantly making the case that we need more artillery, and maybe we are a bit criticized, even I a bit criticized in my Twitter that I'm very forceful making the case that we need more HIMARS, because, it was said numerous times, but quantity is a quality on its own. And this war reminded that no precision can substitute mass. And it's very, very important. So we need constant supply of war materials. We need tube and rocket artillery. We need surface-to-surface missile to be able to wage this modern deep operation, to strike in a rear, to degrade Russian follow-on echelons. Because nowadays, despite that Russian advancements are very slow one, but they are still advancing. We need first and foremost to stabilize the front line. It's a #1 priority. And for this, we need more weaponry like artillery, like means of mobility, like air defense system, like UAVs, secure command and control devices. And we need support more broadly, because, as I said, it's the war of exhaustion, and numerous times it was said by representatives of the Ukrainian authorities that we monthly have a gap of $5 billion between our revenues and our expenditures, and it needs somehow to be covered. And that's the only argument that we are constantly providing, that we need more and more resources to make the case before Russia that they can't outweigh the West, and otherwise it would be a kind of paradox that Russia, with its shrinking amount of GDP, is able to compel such a community of democracies, advanced democracies, which is having much more of a GDP, of economic potential, and so on. So to maybe crown what I said, so both countries, they set a stellar example how Ukraine, Russia-allowed war need to be addressed. And not only example, but making the case that it should be a decisive victory. And I agree with it, with this conclusion that, yes, Russian forces, armed forces, they were humiliated. They have no more this image of omnipotence, but only decisive Ukrainian victory, like at least one major counter-offensive that destroy at least some part of this grouping of forces that is involved in Ukraine, it would deal both physical and psychological blow to the Russians. And I agree with this assessment that Russians need to accept the fact that they won't replay in the future the results of this battle. So, example, brilliant one. And what we need constant supply of war materials, and more broadly, resources to sustain the fight, and Russia, to make Russia understand that they can just outweigh international community and Western community.
Okay, Mykola, very brief question. Politicians describe their attitude towards Ukraine the following way. There is a group saying that Ukraine must win, and there is Angus, there is Mr. Przydacz, Przemysław, and there are those who say that Ukraine must not be defeated. So there are two quite different way of shaping the policy. So what you prefer if you hear Ukraine must win and Ukraine must not be defeated? Which of these two political propositions are of your preference?
Well, that's a simple question to answer for Ukrainian. Well, certainly we would like the consensus to move from Ukraine. Russia should not be allowed to prevail and to crush this minimalist consensus, I would say. And we should move to the maximalist consensus. There are countless arguments. We can argue and make the case for the hours why this is so in terms of grand strategy, in terms of the stakes for the international security. So I'm definitely on the side that Russia needs to be taught a lesson that in the 21st century, all-out aggression, it doesn't pay. So it should be a decisive victory, basically to heal Russia from imperialism. That is the problem, that we have the country when empire disintegrated in 1991, Russians were not healed out of this problem of imperialism. So if Russia is healed of this illness, basically, and Ukraine is ready to bear the brunt of this task, but we need to provide it equipment, we need to provide it instruments. That's why I am 100% for decisive Ukrainian win, and I agree again with assessment of my co-panelists that no declaration would matter, only declarations and only agreements based on a balance of power, on hard power.
Okay, I have a message to the audience. Prepare your questions and interventions now. I will open the floor soon for you. The same message to our virtual followers. They are already engaging. So we are coming back to Angus with this brief question about definition of Ukraine's win. How you define it?
Yeah, so look, it's a really interesting and important question, and I think there are kind of at least four aspects to it that we should have in mind. So the first, and actually, I mean, personally, I feel this is the most important, is that it seems to me that fundamentally this war is about Russia's refusal to accept that Ukraine is an independent state that can make its own mind up about its own future, its democracy, how it's governed, its alliances, its partnerships in the world. And so for me, I think the most important thing is that this war ends in a way that leaves Ukraine free to make those decisions itself, that it's the independence of the country, its sustainability, its viability as a state that is the most important factor. The second set of issues obviously are around the geography and the territory. And, there's, I think the British Foreign Secretary has been very clear that she would like to see Russia out of Ukraine, full stop. Exactly where the war ends and, whether it's possible to reclaim how much territory, I think that in the end is something that comes down to a judgment of Ukraine itself. But it's very clear that the UK will support Ukraine in that judgment. But I would say there are then two other aspects to this question. So the first is about the impact that this war has on Russia itself. And I think we've made very clear in the UK that, we are not defining success as a particular outcome for the government of Russia, for the regime in Russia. I mean, we might all have views about what we would like to see happen in Russia or not happen in Russia, but that isn't really what this is about. But it does have to end in a way, I think, where Russia understands that attacking sovereign countries in Europe is not going to work. It's not going to succeed. And that applies not just to Ukraine, but also to Georgia and Moldova, and indeed countries who are members of NATO. So I think that would be my third point. There has to be an impact on Russia, not necessarily about its regime, but about how it approaches security in Europe. And then I think the last point is there is a message to the wider world here. And I think this is something, again, that the Foreign Secretary has been very clear about, that other authoritarian regimes around the world need to see from the end of this war that actually the Western democracies, or democracies globally, free countries globally, are prepared to stand up for their independence and their freedom, that we're not going to be pushed around and we're not going to allow fait accomplis to be created by force. So I think those are the four things. But I think for me, of those four, the most important is that Ukraine emerges from this war as a fully independent, sovereign country that can make its own choices about its own future.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, I think the Angus point that Russia would be defeated when the Russians and the Russian government would recognize the fact that it was defeat, and Russia was defeated in Ukraine, is very important. How to do that? When Russia would recognize that it was defeated on Ukraine, what are, very briefly, Przemek, in few sentences, this criteria of defeat for the Russians?
Well, Russia knows no other form of its statehood but the expansionist empire. And the rulers are judged according to whether they are effective in this policy or not. And the internal shake of Russian empire, like after Crimean War or after Japanese War, after the First World War, or after Afghan War, are always connected with the defeat on the battlefield. This particular war is or has been launched due to internal reasons, mainly, namely due to the fact that functioning democracy in the area of the so-called Ruski Mir is a challenge for the stability of Russian internal stability, Russian government. So to defeat it, I think we have to demonstrate to Russian public first that the costs of the war are too high in human terms, which would be difficult because what really matters in political sense are capitals, Moscow and Petersburg, that are not suffering in the human dimension. It's rather province, the so-called Głubinka. On the other side, some symbolic defeats like the sink of cruiser Moscow. Yeah? If we can multiply this kind of successes of Ukrainian army, that would be appealing to Russian public opinion. It would be convinced in that way that it's losing the war. And the liberation of some important Ukrainian territories, like Kherson, for example. He was talking about this decisive counter-offensive. But generally, it will take a long time, I am afraid.
Thank you very much. Now I open the floor for questions, and I have already 4 questions, individuals asking for questions. So, first one, please. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you very all. I took an awful lot of notes. The name's Ewan Grant. I used to be the UK Customs Service's intelligence analyst for the ex-Soviet states. I've subsequently worked for EU missions in Ukraine. Proud to work alongside Polish colleagues, very proud, but I also saw disgraceful German behavior. Not all Germans, some Germans. My question for you all is do you see that Poland has a huge advantage over the UK in that it is still an EU member and it is the frontline state of the eastern border? Do you see that your message, and which is the UK's message, is getting through in the wider civilian and whole of society and whole of government infrastructure in EU Brussels and particularly in France and Germany? Not just government and security, but big business. I think Total Oil really needs to be held to account because that can show real failures of imagination. Is Poland's message getting through there? Thank you.
So there's a question to Przemysław. We will collect a few others.
I'm Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform. My question follows on from the previous question. I was in Paris last week, and obviously there are there's a perception of 2 camps in the European Union. There's the French, German, Italian camp who are perceived to be relatively soft, and there's the Poles and the Balts and others who are rather tougher with the British in the same camp. The question is whether or not, as the war continues, we can keep Western unity together or not. Certainly, the view I got in Paris was that the British tend to exaggerate the differences between themselves and the French. The British have been briefing that the French are soft on Russia and can't be trusted, and the French resent that. Their line is our policy is actually almost the same as the British. We do not want Ukraine to trade land for peace. We don't want Ukraine to make peace unless it feels it freely wishes to do so, and we want Ukraine to have a victory. But nevertheless, the French don't like it when the Estonian Prime Minister talks about isolating Russia. The French say we have to contain Russia, not isolate it, because after the war is over, we'll have to have a relationship with it of some sort, so we shouldn't cut off all contact. So my question for the panelists is, how worried are you by the differences of approach across the European Union, and do you think the EU can stay together if the war goes on and on and on for many years?
Very good question. Professor Krasnodębski.
I have two questions. One short question concerning history to Professor Przemysław, Żurawski, Grajewski. You said we fought 18 wars. How many we won? So this would be the question. And to our visitor from Ukraine, I wanted to go in the same direction. We have a division in Europe. I think it's you are very so positive about British, Polish politics. We can add Baltic states, Sweden, probably Finland, or of course United States. But on the other hand, we have this club of reluctance. Yeah, and how do you interpret this division line? Yeah, because. What are the reasons and what are the consequences? Do you think it will remain like so? And how will this affect your future policy?
And the last intervention this turn, this round.
Yes, thank you. My name's Ian Anthony from SIPRI Research Institute in Stockholm. I wanted to ask you about how the UK, Poland and Ukraine should approach other countries which have an interest in this beyond the Western Europe, if you like. I mean, Belarus is now an extremely important piece of real estate, if you like, in the context of the conflict. We had this remarkable speech by the president of Kazakhstan the other day, really trying to differentiate himself from Russia's perspectives. What would be the way in which countries which have a certain influence on Russia should be approached in the current conditions?
Okay, so let's start from Przemek now.
The most simple question, 5. As long as we were fighting together with Ukrainians, we always won. When we ceased to do that, we always lost.
And succeeded in burning Moscow.
Yes. Well, even our last war, victorious war against Soviet Russia in 1920 was fought together with Ukrainians. We won. As far as the contemporary problems are concerned, I'm afraid my answer to the question about the European unity is negative. I'm pessimist. And the reasons are quite obvious. As I have already said, we cannot afford being naive living between Germany and Russia. And just answer yourselves, what would be the outcome of Ukrainian victory for the European balance of power? That means the creation of the strong pro-Atlantic bloc in the east, constituted with, taking from the north, Sweden, Finland, Baltic states, Poland, Romania and Ukraine, all with very tough image of Russia. All interested in as large American military presence and political presence in the European security structure, which means the reduction of the political position of Germany and France. I think all of us know that, the Germans and the French too. And this is what we have to expect from their side. Plus some mental tradition. I mean, just not to be too long, to give you one symbol, there is the bridge of Alexander III in Paris. Alexander III, under the rule of him, it was forbidden to teach children in Poland in Polish, and if you speak Polish at school, you could be whipped. So this is the basic cultural difference. I mean, Russia is the traditional ally of France since 1892, in First World War, in Second World War, and for the Germans, it's the memory of the substantial defeat. So the policy of Bismarck, when there was no Central Europe, there was a direct border between Germany and Russia, is for some forces marginal, for sure, like AfD. Nevertheless, the conflict with Russia is something unimaginable for German public opinion too. Plus corruption. That's another long story.
Belarus? There was a question from Anthony about the other aspects of this conflict. I mean, how should we deal with Belarus or Kazakhstan also? I mean, trying to find their own way into this Ruski Mir policy towards Ukraine.
Kazakhstan is a very interesting example because the President Tokayev has been just put into power by Russian intervention in January, and then he refused to support Russian aggression on Ukraine for obvious reasons, namely the majority of population in the northern provinces of Kazakhstan are Russian-speaking population, so I think the similar threat is direct for Kazakhstan. And I would ask the question about the Chinese influence in the region. I mean, Tokayev would not be that brave without the support from any other large power. As far as Belarus is concerned, it's another long story. This is the former bulk territory of the historically Great Duchy of Lithuania, and after the stolen elections 2 years ago, there is a revoke of the society and the historical memory of that society. And of course, there is no tradition whatsoever of hostility between Belarusians and Ukrainians, so one can hardly produce the Belarusian aggression on Ukraine with the support of the Belarusian society. Nevertheless, I think this country is in the process of very deep internal changes, mental changes, that finally, step by step, far lower than in Ukraine, but will lead to the same direction, namely to the national renaissance of Belarusian identity based on the former Polish-Lithuanian political tradition and not Russian imperial tradition. This is what the polls made by Center for Eastern Studies in Warsaw shows us. 40% of the population feels, in Belarus, feels to be the heirs of the Great Duchy of Lithuania and not of Russian Empire. This says something.
Thank you, Przemysław. Angus, you have been moving to Brussels, so you are in transition period. So using this opportunity, so that you are not yet responsible for NATO's unity, can you tell us your assessment about how long we can keep this NATO European unity on Ukraine? It's a really important question, how to do it actually. And are you more optimistic in this regard than Przemysław is?
Yeah, well, I think that to go to Charles's analysis or briefing from the French, they're not wrong that actually there is far more unity than disunity amongst the big Western states at the moment. Certainly the Quad grouping of US, Germany, France, UK is working very well. But it's also true that different members of that group place different emphasis on bits of the same policy. So France may not be comfortable with the emphasis that we have placed on robust support for Ukraine. But the fact is France has chosen to place the emphasis, until quite recently anyway, on dialogue with Russia. And in particular, of the solution to all of this being a European solution, not particularly a solution involving the US. So, I mean, we've both made choices about which bits of the policy, if you like, to emphasize, and we have to assume the consequences of making those choices. I mean, why, to pick up somebody else's question, why those differences in emphasis? Well, I think, the UK and Poland have had different experiences of their relationship with Russia over the last couple of years. We were obviously very marked by the Litvinenko assassination and then the Skripal attempted assassination, both of which I think brought home to the UK state and commentariat something about the nature of the regime in Russia that we were dealing with. And I think France and Germany both chose to place more belief in the value of, dialogue with Russia. As far as the future is concerned, I'm more optimistic actually, and I'm more optimistic for two reasons. Although one of them is a pretty grim reason. But the first reason is I think there is an underlying shift in European public opinion about Russia, and it may be that politics in some countries hasn't caught up with it. But certainly, if you look at public opinion in Germany, it's shifted a very long way, very quickly, and it's definitely a little bit ahead of politics. France, for reasons which I think are probably not much to do with Russia, has swung in its politics towards more NATO skepticism, more favor for dialogue with Russia. But I think even there, the public opinion is in a different place. So I think that the long-term undercurrent of public opinion in Europe will pull us towards quite a robust position. But the other reason, I think, quite frankly, is that attempts to engage Russia and attempts to persuade Russia to be more reasonable, whether we do it directly or whether, as I think it was Anthony asked, whether we can try and do it through countries like Belarus, those attempts keep failing. And they keep failing because Russia's not interested and Russia's not listening. I'm not quite sure who President Putin is listening to. And I've heard it suggested he's essentially listening to Ivan I, Peter I, and Catherine II. He's not really listening to anybody else. But attempts by us in the West to engage Russia and try and persuade them to be more reasonable are just not working. And as long as they're not working, we will be forced, whether we like it or not, into a pretty robust position.
Thank you. I have two questions from the virtual world. Stella holds, and I think that requires a very short answer from you, Angus, yes or no. So Stella Howell asked whether United Kingdom has shipped any biological weapons to Ukraine. Yes or no? And the second question. No. From Witold Drodkiewicz, he's an expert of Center for Eastern Studies. He asked whether we should be prepared that Russia, trying to prevent defeat on Ukraine, may want to use a nuclear weapon, and what should we do in such to prevent it, or in such circumstances. So I will put both of questions on your table.
Thanks. Well, the answer to the first question is definitely no. No debate. On the second question, look, I mean, Russia is a nuclear power. We have to take that very seriously. I think we have certainly taken very seriously NATO's own deterrence and, making very, very clear that any use of not just a nuclear weapon, but also of chemical, biological weapons in Ukraine would be a very serious step and would invite consequences. I think it's difficult to speculate about this. I think most analysts would feel that the most likely scenario would be if Russia suddenly found itself facing a catastrophic defeat, a sudden kind of collapse in its forces in Ukraine, perhaps the sudden loss of Crimea. In those circumstances, Russian nuclear doctrine does envisage the possible use of nuclear weapons. But to be honest, we're speculating here, and any use of nuclear weapons would come at an incredibly high price to Russia in all sorts of ways. So, I think we're right at the moment to focus on how do we help Ukraine win a conventional war that it's fighting with remarkable resilience and success so far. And that's where our focus should stay.
Thank Thank you. I would like to have Mykola's response on nuclear thing. So, how this kind of speculations influence debate in Ukraine about the resistance, about the end game of war. Do you feel that Russian in the end of this war, when you become in the position to win, can restore to nuclear power?
Well, it was said that Russia has this point in this nuclear doctrine, but it says about existential threat. Russia being defeated in Ukraine is not an existential threat. It's just been taught a lesson that aggression, it should be a case in 21st century. So it's not existential threat in terms that Ukrainians going to Moscow and taking Moscow. And we are not waging war against Russian society, except those, of course, who are directly involved in aggression against us. So we have a right for self-defense. Well, the issue of hypothetical threats to use even tactical nuke as an example to teach a lesson is first of all treated as a case of implicit nuclear threat used by Russia to lessen the level of support and to influence the discussion in the West. Basically, even at the start of the conflict, I have also discussions with US experts, and I said to them, well, we in Ukraine no longer fear anything. And for us, it's very pity to see that more powerful countries, nuclear countries, countries with superior conventional potential, they still fear something. That's why we need to fight this implicit nuclear threat to demonstrate that it's null and void, and to make a case that Russia being defeated conventionally in Ukraine is not existential threat. And maybe it was said how third countries should be used. Maybe through China, Russia should be explained that even using in demonstration of tactical nukes means bringing the world in something unknown territory, so it shouldn't be done.
Thank you very much. Next questions from the audience.
Thank you for giving this opportunity. I'm Dr. Khan. As a teacher and student of politics and history, I was listening very avidly to what the professor was saying about, and there was a very interesting analogy between the revival of Nazi Germany in 30s and how Russia is now thinking on similar lines since its demise of the Soviet Union in 1992. I was just wondering, there was mention of protected warfare, which is ensuing now in Ukraine, and then there is a need to educate the Russian public and also on the adverse impact of this invasion. So I was just wondering what can be the channels through which the West can induce or can influence the Russians on this account that this war is not in their favor. And the other thing which I was wondering is in terms of any negotiated peace, maybe in the long term, if it's going to be protected warfare, it will be very costly for all the stakeholders. So is there any chance of a negotiated peace in the long term, and how it could be possible? And the last, what role Poland can play in this direction? Sorry, there are 2-3 strands to this question. Thank you.
Gentleman, Niba.
Artur Kozłowski, WSB University, Gdańsk, Poland. Well, even though I agree with most of what you said, I think we represent rather wishful thinking here. I would like to emphasize that I am a very great friend of Ukraine. I do support Ukraine, although we discuss the defeat of Russia, but Russia actually is or Russian soldiers are in Ukraine, and it rather looks like they will incorporate Donbas to their territory. So even though I would like to see Russia to be defeated, we should rather look into the history and to the example that Russia is not really losing many wars in the past. Just to remind you, 1918, when they were defeated by Germans in the Eastern Front, the Russian strategy was no peace, no war. And I presume we will have something like situation when the Donbass will be under Russian control, and they will be willing only to negotiate peace if Ukraine will admit it is agreeing with losing this territory. So we will have another challenge. The Russian strategy will be a bilateral agreement with those states who will support this end of the war. I don't think it is a very good solution, but we should also face this example: no peace, no war.
And last question from a lady in the second row here. Here.
Hello, thank you very much for your insights so far. I'm Marta Konko from British Polls, and I've recently familiarized myself with the debate between realists and idealists in the context of resolving the war. And what I wanted to ask you is whether we should consider, at least to some extent, the political interests of Russia in finding a resolution to the war. And additionally to that, I wanted to ask what are the interests of Russian people and whether they're the same as Putin's.
Very good. And Robin, very last question because we are running out of time.
Very quickly, I don't want to get with tea. To Charles Grant's actually question we can talk about later, but I've been struck how Spanish public opinion has become very anti-Russian. And again, the government position is very different to what was said earlier. Angus, you said a fully independent Ukraine needs to be the objective. Where does Odessa fit into that part of the picture?
Okay, so we have actually all these questions come to the point about negotiated peace and how this peace may look like. So I would like to start from Mykola, then Przemysław, and then Angus. So please try to respond to all these concerns, how this end game may look like in Ukraine.
First of all, I want to specifically refer to the question about no peace, no war. First of all, I want to emphasize that Russian image of omnipotence is overemphasized, and you said that Russia was winning in the 20th century. Actually, if you look, it just won the Second World War, being allied with U.S. major economic powerhouse. So that's only the case. So they lose other major wars. And without Ukrainian manpower, they won't be able to sustain regional wars. So that's one thing. The second thing, we all already see the major example what are results when we try to look compromise. We have this Minsk I, Minsk II agreement. What basically happened? Russia was allowed to consolidate its gains, regroup, finish process of modernization and rearmament, and then launch all-out aggression. What are you making case for? It's another round of dismemberment of Ukraine. So if you are okay with it, then yes, that would be the case if we allow Russia this time to consolidate its gains, to mobilize those man population on newly acquired territories and engage them in a war against Ukraine. And that's the problem basically with the Western strategic culture. Some of the countries, specifically continental Europe, they are for compromise. And Russia is using this culture for compromise. There is no room for compromise. So if we agree for the compromise, it means that another round of dismemberment of Ukraine would happen and war would continue. That's why it's time as for me to learn the lessons and make a decisive battle, to confront Russia on the front line where it is and not to confront it somewhere to the west of Ukraine.
Przemysław.
Well, first, it's a myth. I mean, this formula, no war was no peace, was really presented by the Bolshevik government, but it resulted in the German Austro-Hungarian offensive, and Russia was forced to sign the peace on March the 3rd, 1918. That was the end of the story. Coming back to the present reality, I'm afraid what I have already said, that both scenarios could be described in the character of wishful thinking. I mean, we are talking about the final peace and not about the armistice or suspension of hostilities, whatever they are officially called. And so, of course, we can imagine the situation in which war is stopped for a while with some treaty that is signed, with this or that Ukrainian province under Russian suzerainty, or under Russian occupation, in fact. But this will be just the break in the chain of wars and not the peace. And that's the problem. We can do that remembering one important thing, that if we propose to give up some land, this formula, land for peace, we are giving people, not just the soil. And those people will be shot in their heads, or will be imposed Russian citizenship, or will be deported deep into Russia, as always. It is all Russian wars were like that. And your question was about the realistic and idealistic approach. Politics doesn't work like that, simply. And please remember that Russian what does it mean, Russian interest? You mean the interest of the mafia of Siłowiks that rules Kremlin, or Russian imperial interest, or the interest of Russian people? We have three levels. Yeah? In the interest of Russian people is to resign from empire and to work hard to rise the life of the level of the life. Yeah? But who cares about Russian people in Russian government? Nobody. Yeah? Do you remember how the Chechen War, the Second Chechen War started? Yeah, with the blowing up of the blocks of flats with Russians.
I take mic away of you, okay. And now it's time for Angus to have a few concluding remarks. Angus.
Thanks, Sławomir. I mean, look, I've never worked out what I am in international relations terminology. I used to think I was a realist, but the more I read of realist thinking on Ukraine, Russia, the more I think I must be some sort of mad idealist instead. But look, one person I do read and I think is excellent is Keir Giles at Chatham House. And, you know, he has been arguing, as have others, James Nixie and others, for some time, that we have to understand that for a decade or more now, Russia has seen itself as being at war with the West, not always an openly declared war, often a hidden covert war, but fundamentally believing that it has to undermine, disrupt, even bring down the structures of the democratic political West. And I think once you understand that, you realize that even if there is a pause or a stop in the war in Ukraine at some point, in future, and obviously from a kind of human suffering perspective, that would be good. Even if there is such a pause, as long as we have this regime in Moscow, the chances are that the war will carry on in other ways, and it will restart and come back again in different forms, possibly again in Ukraine. And indeed, there were people who were arguing that this was exactly the case in 2014, that it was a pause in the conflict. So I think we just have to keep that absolutely in mind. I think on Odessa, I mean, Odessa is obviously critical. It's a major city. It's the major export route for Ukrainian grain in particular. So I think it is strategically significant. And I think one of the reasons why we feel we have to do absolutely everything we can to support Ukraine right now is that if you assume that this year's fighting season, to use a dreadful phrase, is about the Donbass, the question becomes, what does Russia look to do next year, next summer? And we mustn't be in a situation, Ukraine mustn't be in a situation where Russia feels, yep, we've done the Donbass, and now next year we can move on to seizing the rest of the Black Sea coast and Odessa. I think that would be strategically very, very bad. So I think Odessa is key. It's key right now to world exports of food and tackling hunger globally. That's why we're supporting the UN-led efforts to try and open a route into Odessa.
Thank you very much. This is the end of the first panel. I think that the general message is very optimistic, particularly for Ukraine. You can hear that the panelists, ministers, and general audience are on Ukraine's side. And you can hear also that there is a wide, unshaken support for Ukraine, and this support will continue. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists for being with us and sharing with us.